All right, welcome. This is an intro to ecosystems. Today we'll talk a little bit about systems in general and then talk about some of the components of what you might find in an ecosystem. And then finally we'll practice a little bit with some more information about Mono Lake and the case of the missing salt. So let's get started. All right, a couple things here first. Please make sure that you access the link to the live session through our Canvas class. Every day it helps log attendance for me, so I have a backup. Please, let's commit to doing our own work. And I'd like you guys today, at some point over the next week or so, to go to myap.collegeboard.org, and I want you to sign up for the AP Classroom. These codes, I'm not going to leave them on the screen for too long. They're available in the Canvas class, and I'll show you later. Let's change our avatar on Canvas so that it's a real live actual picture of you. So that when I go through and I grade your writing, I can see and have kind of an idea about who you are and what you look like. And in the live class, we go over a little bit of information about how you can take notes in Google Docs, and make sure you attend our live sessions. All right, so previously we talked a little bit about systems in general. Systems are an interconnected set of parts that all work together. And in terms of energy and matter, take a look at this, right? In terms of energy, our world here is an open system. The solar radiation comes in from the sun. It heats up our world, and also plants are able to utilize and transform that light into chemical food. But then it also exits our system too, right, in the form of infrared heat as it radiates back out into space. In terms of matter, our world is a closed system, assuming there aren't any major asteroids that hit it and bring in more, matter. But right, so think about what that means in terms of environmental science. This is an opportunity to be sustainable, to use these very finite resources sustainably, so that there's not just enough for us here, but also for more in the future. Take a look at the bottom here. So we can think of then, like, if this is the whole system, right, there are systems within systems too. And that's something that we can explore here in environmental science as well. Take a look here at how we can define some of those systems, right? We can define the whole system and say the biosphere, which is all of the living life that exists in the lithosphere, the hydrosphere, and the atmosphere. Or we can say and define a system within that system as a biome, right? These very special places that are collections of different ecosystems together. Or we can define that system as an ecosystem, right? An ecosystem is a collection of communities that interact with one another in a very specific and physical environment, right? And then, right, think about that, the biotic and the abiotic factors that all are working together to make it a very unique place. Within those ecosystems are communities of organisms. These communities are groups of populations of different types of, not just plants, but also animals, right? If a community then is a collection of population of different animals, a population then is the same species, right? A group of interbreeding individuals that exist as the same species, and we can then even define that system as just the organism, right? And so we've got this kind of continuum, this hierarchy, we'll call it, ecological organization that we can use to help define what system it is we're talking about. So here's what a question might look like on an exam here. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. Which level of ecological organization includes all the rest? Take a moment, think. The correct answer is 4, ecosystem, right? Think about it. An ecosystem is a community of populations of individual organisms. And so ecosystems contain or include all the rest of them listed. So previously we talked a little bit about the human interactions with this ecosystem here that you see on your screen, Yosemite. We talked a little bit about how humans can interact impact the way that it looks, the biotic and the abiotic factors in the area. One way that humans do that is through fire suppression. In this valley, we don't want to have fires because there's infrastructure in there, right? And a fire would destroy, all of that. It's not good. But that fact right there has a consequence. And the consequence is that the soil never actually gets touched by fire. And sequoia trees, their seeds need to have fire-touched soil in order to germinate. And so this act of fire suppression, which is a good thing, right, has this alternate effect, right, on the fact that we're now slowing down the reproduction of sequoia trees. So what's the solution here is one thing that they're doing here in Yosemite is prescribed burns. They take an area and they can burn it down, control the burn so that that soil can get some of those nutrients cycled back into it. This is another interaction here. San Francisco needed a source of water. I'm kind of starting in a different place. So take a look here at the Yosemite National Park. So northwest of Yosemite National Park is the Hetch Hetchy Valley. Well, it was the Hetch Hetchy Valley all the way up until 1923 when it was filled in as a reservoir. It was dammed upriver, the area filled in. And so all of that land right here and all the vegetation that you see here was transformed in the early 1900s into what you're seeing in the picture on the right-hand side, where no more, right? Think of all of the plants and the animals that have either died as a result or were displaced because of this human interaction. So another opportunity here. Now, this is something that's still current. There's conservationists that are interested in trying to restore the Hetch Hetchy Valley to all its splendor. They said that it was looked very similar to Yosemite. It was just as gorgeous, right, and heaven-like, as people usually describe Yosemite. But there's also the other side of the coin, though, that San Franciscans need a reservoir of fresh, clean water, right? So those are some of the issues that we deal with here in environmental science, right? We think about those pros and those cons and trying to make decisions based off of what's best and what's most sustainable. So I went to camping out here we visited Yosemite National Park, my husband and I, and we went to this area here in the eastern Sierra Nevada range. If you're taking a look, this border right here is Nevada's border, and within this area here in California is this large blue blob. It's a lake. It's called Mono Lake. It's an interesting lake in that it is a terminal lake. Terminal lakes are lakes that, they don't have an outlet, right, from their system. So they've got, think about it, other than evaporation, I should say. So think about what's going on here, right? There's rivers and streams that dissolve small amounts of minerals within rocks, salt. And this very slightly salty water in these rivers and streams make their way into Mono Lake. Now, there's no river that allows that water to exit the system. So the only way the water can exit is through evaporation. And so as that water over 120,000 years, that's about how long Mono Lake is, how old it is, over the course of 120,000 years, water has evaporated at a pretty steady rate. Slightly salty water comes into the system. The fresh water leaves, right? Think about it. Salt isn't going to evaporate too. The salt will always stay there. So over 120,000 years or so, there's about 285 billion kilograms of salt within this lake right here. It's saltier than the ocean by about 3 times. And because of that, it's a very unique ecosystem. It's one of the simplest ecosystems in the world because there aren't too many organisms that can actually tolerate that sort of pH level. It's got a pH of about 10, so it's a little alkaline. And they can't handle their salt, that salinity level either. So this is one of the unique features here in Mono Lake are these tufa structures you're looking at, right? There is if you look really carefully, right here is a nest of an osprey. And so there are these birds that live there permanently. It's also stopover for migratory birds too. And so what are they eating? They're eating these little brine shrimp, the sea monkeys. It was a toy back in the day. These little brine shrimp are able to live in a pretty salty environment. And so they've made a home there too. There's some brine flies that are able to tolerate that salt level and pH level, and they're living there too. And these birds come in and they all eat the brine shrimp and the flies. So what are the brine shrimp and the flies eating? In an ecosystem, we always have producers. These producers are those photosynthetic organisms that are able to take and transform that sunlight into organic compounds. And so the producers here in this ecosystem are algae. The algae act as the base of this, well, we'll call it a trophic pyramid, this food web, and they're eaten by the primary consumers, the brine shrimp and the flies, and then those are eaten by the birds. Take a look here. So in 1941, a lot of that water that came in from those streams from, well, you can kind of see the snow in the area. So, right, think about the snow is going to melt. We form that water into streams, and some of those streams and rivers were diverted in an effort to bring more water to Los Angeles. The problem is that, now think about this, right? We only had one input into this mono lake, and there was only one exit for the water, outlet for the water. That was through evaporation. So now if you take away that input, now all that's happening really is an increase of evaporation. So what was happening in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s is this was getting more and more salty as it moved forward, and it was destroying and decimating the ecosystem here, right? That very fragile, very simple ecosystem was getting harmed because of this very obvious interaction, right, that we had with this ecosystem. So, and then there were some other unintended consequences, as is often the case, right? You can kind of see, if you make out this picture here, the border right here of where the level of the lake was. So it has absolutely receded. In the 40s, 50s, and 60s, it was actually so low that these tufa structures, you could actually have these land bridges, and so these coyotes and wolves were coming in and they were eating the eggs or destroying some of the habitat of the birds in the area that would hang out on those tufas, right? So there's these unintended consequences, absolutely. Let's take a look here. So in the 70s and 80s, some conservationists came through and they sought to try to use some science and some research in order to help save Mono Lake. And it was pretty famous in the 70s and 80s to see these bumper stickers all over the place on people's cars. They were able to restore some of the flow from the rivers and streams, but not all of it. And so the area has restored to some level, but not the original level that it was prior to the diversion process. So a little bit of a victory here, but there's some more progress to go. In environmental science, we learned that oftentimes once an ecosystem has been destroyed, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to restore it back to its pristine condition prior to the disruption. So there, yeah, take a look at this, right? I mentioned earlier that those algae that are able to tolerate the pH and the salt level within Mono Lake, these guys are photosynthesizing. They're producing that organic compound for themselves. They produce so much of it that brine shrimp and brine flies are able to feed off of it. So yeah, what are these? These producers are the photosynthesizers. They make the base of our trophic pyramid, if you think of it that way, right? And then from here, these guys are the primary consumers. The primary consumers feed off of the producers. And take a look, these arrows that connect these two species, right? This interaction between these two biotic elements. This arrow represents the flow of energy and matter from one trophic level to the one above it. And then from there, the primary consumers are consumed by the secondary consumers, right? Sometimes ecosystems are able to handle tertiary consumer level, but not here in this case. So you might wonder, why did the California gulls not just feed off of the algae? Because it would take way too many calories to do it, right? I mean, think about it. There aren't supermarkets or whatever out in nature for the California gull to go get their food, right? Their shrimp. So they've got to go out and use calories in order to find more calories, right? So it'd take a lot more work to get enough of this algae for it to feel satiated enough and for it to continue to live and reproduce. And so the California gull then is not going to eat off of the algae. There's this process, right? They're going to eat off of the primary consumers because they're smaller, smaller than the gull, but larger than the algae. And so they pack a meter punch in terms of their nutrition and calories available to them. So one thing I wanted to point out too, oftentimes on these food webs here, we exclude the decomposers. And so I wanted to briefly talk about the role and the importance of the decomposers in an ecosystem. In the monolake ecosystem, the decomposers are primarily bacteria, but others could be yeast, it could be fungi. And what these guys do is really important. It's in terms of matter, this is a closed system, right? For the most part, in terms of the building blocks for life, I should say, it's closed, right? So as these birds and the brine shrimp, flies, and algae die, the decomposers are going to break up and recycle those nutrients back into the system, such that the new algae that will form later on through reproduction are able to use those as building blocks and produce more life and more food for the entire ecosystem, and on it goes in a nice glorious cycle that's been going on for millions and millions of years. So here's what we're going to do today, or here's what we did during our class today, is we went to our modules. You can go to crjust.us/apes on any browser anywhere in the world, and it will bring you to the modules for the class, and here they are. So here's where the video is going to go, right? Under day 2. Here's the slide deck that we just went over in class. Remember one of the slides mentioned to join the AP classroom with the codes, so I've given you guys the link with the codes right there. So you can access it directly from our Canvas class. I wanted to point this out. You guys should take the day 2 quiz at the end. Try to do it as soon as you can, but I would hold off on it until you've watched the video a couple times maybe. Are you watching the video a couple times? I'm hoping you're watching the videos once. Anyway, take maybe after we finish the video and then after this assignment here, the science applied. And so that's what I wanted to spend a moment here with you kind of explaining this, okay? Because one thing we did was we went over some questions at the end of the class for this, and I wanted to give you guys some feedback that are watching this on this video too. So what I want you to do is, in a moment, you'll push pause on the video, and we're going to try to figure out what happened to the missing salt, right? And this is really an introduction to you guys. We're going to learn a little bit more about Mono Lake and its really unique system here that it is. But this is really an introduction to some of the math that you're going to see that APES is kind of famous for. It looks like this. This is called dimensional analysis, and you probably remember this in chemistry when we've got these like units on the numerator and the denominator of different fractions. We're able to cancel and cross those units out, right? So liters salt over liter salt will cancel out, and so that our final unit for our answer will be milligrams over years. And when we look at the answer, sure enough, milligrams salt over year, right? So here's what I want. As you read through this, I want you to read it maybe twice, because it is, you're going to have to follow what exactly it's trying to communicate. But as you go through and see these math problems, I want you to kind of do some mental math, and with your brain, I want you to kind of do some, cross out the like terms and kind of follow along, like, oh, okay, I see that's 6 trillion times, you know what I mean? Go through it and kind of follow along. And then this is the major thing that we're looking at here. So, like, based off of the concentration of the lake, which is about 81 grams of salt per 1 liter of salt, based off of that, it should be about 285 billion kilograms of salt within Mono Lake, right, based off of estimates. But take a look. scientists are like, well, hold up. If Mono Lake is 120,000 years old, right? Think about this. If it's 120,000 years old, and for 120,000 years, it's gotten a certain amount of pretty steady, slightly salty stream and river water, it should be 720 billion kilograms of dissolved salt, right? Hold up. The estimate is 285 billion kilograms of salt, and yet the calculated amount should be significantly more than that. What accounts for that missing salt? Where did it go? So you're going to read a little bit about where it went. I'm going to give you a little bit of a hint. It's going to be something to do with the tufas, right? And then here's what I want. You're going to go through, actually do the discussion questions. I'm going to go over these answers with you at the end of this very video right here, okay? The answers for these 3 questions can be found in the body of the article. And then the free response question right here, do your best trying to answer these in a notebook or in a Google Doc, however you want to do it, and we'll go over it. All right, so if you want to, you can push pause, and we're back. Let's go over the 3 questions. You know what? Here's what I did. I wanted to see what it's like to be a student in my own class, and so I did this assignment. I wrote them out on, I like to write on paper, but if you want to type, that's fine with me. Try it out. Seriously. You'll learn something and it kind of internalizes the information in your brain. And so I did it myself. I just wanted you to know that. I'm hoping that you're doing this too. So take a look here. It says, how did Los Angeles inadvertently conduct an experiment at Mono Lake? They did that by, normally the river and stream water would feed into Mono Lake. And so by diverting it, they kind of, like they put an independent variable into the system. They threw a wrench into the system, so to speak, right? That fine-tuned balance between biotic and abiotic has now been skewed. And so now we're going to see those changes, and we did, sure enough. So yeah, by diverting it, they accidentally started an experiment. And so it's kind of interesting. In APES, one of the FRQ questions, one of the free response questions is for you to design experiment. And I guarantee you they're going to use the words independent variable and dependent variable. You're going to have to know what those are. And so I added a little extra question here, which is the independent variable in our study if this was an actual real live experiment, and which is the dependent variable. So the independent variable is the variable that is manipulated by the researcher, it's changed by the researcher, the scientist. And so what was it that was changed in Mono Lake? The independent variable would be the diversion of the water. And then which is the dependent variable? The dependent variable is dependent on the change that happened, if that makes sense, right? It's the effect. It's after the fact, right? It's, hey, what happened after the water was diverted? And so the dependent variable in this case would be, you could say, the health of the ecosystem. What else did I write? I said the salinity levels, the pH levels, the water levels. All of these could work, absolutely. Second question, which chemical property causes terminal lakes to become more salty? Evaporation, right? The water evaporates away, leaving behind that solid, that salt, well, dissolved salt. And then 3, what is it? What is the reason for the discrepancy between the 2 calculations of salt content in Mono Lake? And the answer was those tufas. Those tufas play a really important role in regulating the pH and the salt content of Mono Lake, right? And so think about this for a moment. It would be way too salty at 720 billion kilograms of salt. It's way too salty to support the brine shrimp. So one of the things that just happens then at that concentration, if it were to go above the normal regular concentration, is that these tufas form and it stores the salt in the form of limestone calcium carbonate rock. Pretty interesting stuff. And then we had that FRQ that I thought was kind of wild to talk. Let me get to that. To talk about, learn about, think about. This will help you out with that quiz too. Identify a biotic and an abiotic factor at Mono Lake, right? The living and the non-living stuff. I wrote down brine shrimp, brine flies, algae for the biotic, for the living factors. You could have said the California gull or any of those number of birds. Absolutely. The abiotic factors at Mono Lake, I wrote down water, salt, the pH of the water, minerals available in the rocks, the calcium carbonate, the tufas, the amount of sunlight, the runoff amounts from the area, right? How much water goes into it. B, explain the role density plays on the system. Density is a relationship between mass and volume. And so that salt water has more mass per volume than regular water that doesn't have any of the salt dissolved in it, if that makes sense. And so that denser water will sit underneath, and that less dense water will hang out on the top. And because of that differential, it has a hard time mixing unless there was like waves or something like that oftentimes, right? But so it will sit like that and diffuse very slowly over the next couple decades. Nobody's fault. It's not a human interaction. It's just something that happened. But it's an effect on, right? And then that change, that quick little disruption can be adapted to or not. And it's likely being adapted to currently, right? C, describe the chemical property of water that allows salt to dissolve. It's polarity. Both water and salt are polar materials, and so they can dissolve each other. Like dissolves like, if you remember that from chemistry. And then finally, D, identify 3 consequences of reduced lake mixing. I said you're not going to have that exchange of the nutrients from the more dense to less dense areas, right? Due to the stratification. So what's going to happen because of that, right? If you don't have that mixture, then you're not going to have as much algae, because those algae require and need those nutrients mixing, and they're not mixing. And so algae growth will decrease. Another effect of that then would be that the brine shrimp and fly, and even maybe the populations of birds, are going to be affected too. You decrease their food source, everyone else's food source decreases too. All right, I hope you learned something, and we'll see you in class.